So this webinar is mainly going to focus on the writing portion for writing your literature review. Last time we focused more on the preparation for it. So we talked about getting started with research questions. We talked a lot about how to evaluate the source and where to find appropriate sources. We talked about what a source matrix is. We're going to talk about that later here, putting your sources in a matrix to find the connections among them. And then, of course, we're reaffirming that the research process is recursive, meaning that you will be looking for sources throughout the whole time you're working on your paper, maybe even up to the due date. It's not that at one point you need to stop researching and just focus on the writing, because you might find that you need more sources to reinforce whatever you're talking about. And that's perfectly normal. So you don't need to worry about that. Okay, so now it is time to write those, because eventually you will need to have a paper to hand in to your professors. Whether your literature review is just one section of a research article or the entire paper, you need some sort of strategy to organize your writing with it. And one strategy you can use is called the Creative Research Space model, or the CARS model. Basically, it looks like this. It was developed by a man called John Swales and Professor Christine Feek. Basically, it's a series of steps in order for you to justify why you're writing or justify why you're doing the research. 3 steps: establishing your research territory, establishing a niche within the territory, and then occupying that niche yourself. And let me explain what I mean. So it's sort of like the opening of a game of chess. So your opening move sets forth the game. And so when you establish your research territory, you show that your general research area is important, central, interesting, problematic, or relevant in some way. But there's something interesting about your research area. You do this by introducing and reviewing items of previous research in this area. And so you often find phrases like this within this area of the literature review. So recently, there's been growing interest in Kazakhstan, or the development of the oil pipeline has led to the hope that blah, blah, blah. Many recent studies have focused on Kyrgyzstan and so forth. So you're basically just establishing a research trend in your area. Are you showing what is the status of current research in your field of interest? However, there will come a point where you need to find your niche within the general research area. You do this by focusing on one specific area within your broader research area. You do this by either problematizing research, indicating a gap in the previous research, or by extending previous knowledge in some way. So let me explain. There are different ways that you can do this. The most controversial or the strongest way is counterclaiming a common idea. In other words, saying that something is wrong. For example, there was a study that said that vaccines cause autism. A strong counter study would say that the results of that were incorrect. So you're correcting a problem. More commonly, though, is that you often indicate there's a gap in the research. In other words, something is missing. Maybe a lot of research has focused on Kazakhstan rather than Kyrgyzstan. So you're saying there is a gap in knowledge about Kyrgyzstan or another Central Asian country. Or maybe you say that something is unclear in the research and your job is to clarify what the meaning is. Or you simply raise a question about what previous research has said. Or you could simply just add on to previous research. So in a lot of STEM fields, you do experiments to confirm what has been done before. And that's perfectly fine. You're showing that this theory holds ground, it holds water, that the results can be replicated over and over again. And that's perfectly fine. But often you'll see that people indicate there's a gap in the literature, meaning that something has not been studied. That's the most common one. Some phrases you might see to signal that you're problematizing research. So things like research is tended to focus on Kazakhstan rather than on Kyrgyzstan. None of these studies have focused on Turkmenistan, and so on and so forth. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, isn't this plagiarism? Because these phrases, I'm just sort of copying them and putting it in. It's a tricky subject because these are common rhetorical ways to organize structures. So I do not consider this plagiarism. Other professors might. However, you tend, when you read literature, to see phrases like this appear over and over again. And so it's my belief that this is not considered plagiarism. But as always, you can discuss that with your professor. Then in the third and final part, the checkmate of the chess game, you occupy the niche yourself. In other words, you step in to solve the problem. In a research paper, this is done by many ways. You outline the purposes of the present research, you list your questions or hypotheses, announce principal findings, state the value of your present research, indicate the structure of the following research project, or if the paper is only a literature review, this would be the conclusion where you suggest further research to address the limits of the current knowledge. So here you would say that we need future studies that examine phenomenon that weren't addressed in the current literature. Now, throughout all of this, you can't ignore your transitions. So when I teach 150, I teach students that transitions are very important because they help guide the reader like you would through a map. You basically navigate the reader through your ideas. And we do this with different types of transitions. So we have big transitions, what I call the big picture signposts. Having a strong introduction and thesis and conclusion helps reinforce the whole idea of the paper, along with an outline of the argument and process. And really, if you're writing a thesis or dissertation, each section should end with a summary of what you did in the previous section, and then state in the next section what you will do. So this way it prepares the reader to move step by step. One reason why these are important is because people often don't read a whole dissertation or a whole book in one sitting. They'll read part, and then when they end a section, they'll put it down. So this way, when they bring it back up, they can easily keep pace with what the argument is. So transitions are very important. Then of course, we have our paragraph level transitions, topic sentences. So you always want to make sure that your paragraph is clear with what it's about and keep it to one central idea. And then with the concluding sentences to prepare the reader for the next paragraph. And then of course we have sentence to sentence. So relationships between ideas via transition words, and informal transitions such as pronouns, repeated keywords, and synonyms. And so this is an activity that I show some of my students where you would put the appropriate transitional word or phrase so that things connect with each other. So in addition might be to start off with this sentence to show there's a connection or an addition of an idea, etc. And if I go out of here really quickly, and if I can go into this, I actually have a PDF, and you can request me for this. about many different types of transition words and phrases. So words to show addition, cause and effect, such as a consequence, finally, etc. Words to compare, words to contrast, emphasize, such as in particular, particularly, words to show you're doing an example, words to extend onto something, sequencing, such as first, second, third, summary and conclusion, and words for time. Many different transitions that you can use throughout a paper. And you'll see that this PDF shows a sample paragraph that shows each different type of transition, how they're used within the paragraph. So don't neglect your transitions when you're writing your literature review. Okay, so back in here. Okay, I talked about this last time, but you want to make sure that your literature review is a proper page rather than an annotated bibliography. Let me explain. So sometimes I will see papers that look like this. Author one talks about this, this, and this. He then talks about this. I think he is right because he answered my thesis, which is blah, blah, blah. Author two talks about this, this, and this. She then talks about this. I think she is right because she answered my thesis, which is blah, blah, blah. Author three talks about this, this, and this. He then talks about this. I think he is kind of right because he kind of answered my thesis, which is, and so on and so forth. I do not consider this a proper paper. Instead, I just consider this like a list of sources. Again, you need to think about how the sources connect together to make meaning. So rather than just dumping sources into your paper in order to meet the requirements for how many sources or page length, you need to be thinking about how to synthesize your sources together so that the sum of the parts are more than the whole. And what I mean by that is when you finish the paper, you have a concise and clear meaning that uses all of the sources together to create a new unique paper, right? Just as in with this cat statue, we have these different Legos, but when you put them together, it creates this beautiful work of art that you haven't seen before. I like cats, so I'm gonna call it beautiful. You might not think it's beautiful, but whatever. Anyway, we also saw this last time. This is a source matrix. This is while you're doing your research. So what you do is you put in your sources side by side like this. You find common ideas among all of them. And then you group these common ideas under labels for the themes. So let's say you're studying anxiety in graduate students. You find a lot of sources that talk about the multiple roles of graduate students. So you align them up like this and give the title multiple roles. You find different sources that talk about relationships, and you find different sources that talk about the classroom environment. Importantly, some sources have multiple themes. Some sources have only one. Don't force a source to say something that it's not actually saying. Instead, assign it to a theme and see which sources fall under one theme. It's more important that you have multiple sources which each theme than trying to make a source say something it doesn't actually say. Now, here we get to the important part, which is how does this appear in writing? So I teach APA. I find that APA, it's very simple to group sources like this. So let's take the first sentence here. Swider investigated the causes of traffic accidents using the CARS method. Full sentence, we have the subject Swider. Swider did something. He investigated the causes of traffic accidents using the CARS method. So that's a very simple way that you can talk about a source in your paper. However, let's look at the second one. The causes of traffic accidents were investigated by Benson and Swider. Now we have two sources here. The connection between the two sources is that they investigated the causes of traffic accidents. However, we might have done it using different methodology. For example, Swider used the cars method. Benson used the truck method. But they both studied the causes of traffic accidents, and so they are linked together in that way. The third sentence is the same, except this time we remove the actors from the sentence. So sometimes it's not important to know who the researcher is. It's more important to know that the study has been done or that something has been examined. So that's why in APA, you'll often have things at the end in parentheses, is because you remove the researchers from the sentence. Now let's look at the fourth sentence. The causes of traffic accidents are complex. We have four names: Anderson, Benson, Swider, York. These are four different studies that are interlinked by the idea that the causes of traffic accidents are complex. This is what you as the writer found as the link between all of these sources. So this is why I say that the whole should be more than the sum of parts. You analyzed all of these sources and you found a common idea among them in that the causes of traffic accidents are complex. Now, Swider and Benson might have done a scientific study. Anderson might have reviewed government statistics. And York may have simply done another literature review. But all of these types of sources are synthesized together to give you the idea that the causes of traffic accidents are complex. And then the last one simply adds a hedging element, because when you're writing, it's a little bit dangerous to say that with 100% certainty that you understand something. So here we say traffic accidents appear to have a complex set of causes. So this is your claim as the author. From studying it, it looks like it might be complex. It might not, but here's the evidence I'm giving to you. So other hedging elements are might be, could be, etc. So you rarely state things with 100% certainty in your findings. And just a quick review with APA, if you have two or more works in the same parentheses, order them the way they appear in the reference list, separated by a semicolon. So here we have Burnt and then Harlow. If you have authors with the same last name, you use the first initial with the last name. So E. Johnson and then L. Johnson, like that. Okay. So here we have an example. You might recognize it from the last webinar. This is a lit review organized thematically, so by sub-theme. So this topic was talking about writing literature reviews, and the writer found three themes in the literature: length of time students spend on writing lit reviews, the amount of revision typically required by thesis advisors, and the extent to which highlighters help or hinder the review process. So from their source matrix, they found these major themes in the literature. So when they're talking about the first theme, they find several studies found something with length of time. Horowitz found that the average number of hours spent on a lit review is 22.6. This is very close to the finding of Smith, who in a study of Harvard Divinity School graduates found an average time of 21.8. So here we see a basic connection, is that this second study is close to the first study. They're linked in some way, and you indicate that at the beginning here. This is very close to the finding of Smith. So you see already how you can start connecting sources together. This next paragraph shows it even more conclusively. Amount of revision typically required by thesis advisors. Downs, Thomas, and Hyperion have concluded that advisors always require at least 2 drafts of a lit review. Now, they found slightly different ways to require it, but all of them found at least 2 drafts are required. That is a conclusion that you as the researcher came up with as you reviewed these, because it is the minimum that is true. What do I mean? So next we see that in terms of the high end of the spectrum, these studies vary in their findings. Downs found a maximum of 10, Thomas found a maximum of 14, while the highest was Hyperion's at 274. So they found different requirements, but at least 2 is true of all of them, right? However, we also find another connection later on. These studies have all been challenged by Xi's study, which determined that advisors in social science fields require on average 2 more revisions than advisors in engineering or biological sciences, while some engineering advisors require only 1 revision. So Xi does not fit in with these others because one of his findings was only 1 revision. But we still include this study because it talks about the theme. So you have to be honest with your sources. You cannot manipulate sources to where they become untrue, but you find the connections among ones that confirm similar things. And that is synthesizing your sources. This is a study that I worked on with a student in my program. She actually did most of the writing for this. But you can see this is sort of from our beginning. We talked about paratextual impact on reading processes, which is basically if you read a biological work about an author, does it affect your perceptions of the work? And so we had to incorporate a lot of research that talked about this field before. And so we see there are a number of studies on literary reactions and paratextual impact. And we have, I'm guessing, about a dozen or over a dozen studies here that all are connected by this idea. Yet you see at the end, however, none of these studies examined the cognitive process of readers' reading reactions to poetry. So here I kind of step into filling the niche, right? Or occupying the niche. That all of these studies talked about this idea, but they didn't talk about this specific idea. And here's where we step in, and here we are to solve that problem. Now, typical reporting verbs when you're doing a literature review, if the author is giving an opinion, you'll see that they claim, imply, or assume something. If the author is stating a finding, you want to reflect that. So you'll write that the author states, reports, or studies something. However, sometimes it's a mixture of both. So what the author is doing is that they are interpreting their findings. So they demonstrate something, they found something, or they show something, where it's a mixture of raw data with their own interpretation of that data. The most important thing, again, is that you're being honest with the literature. So don't say that an author reports something when they're merely suggesting it. right? In other words, you've misrepresented the literature, and you have to be careful with that. While you're writing, there are differences between summaries, paraphrases, and quotations. Um, a summary is a condensed version of an author's key points in your own words. It's used when you need to explain the key points of a text so the reader can understand your argument. In other words, the reader is not going to read a whole book by an author unless you give them the key points and then they want to go off and read it. That's their choice. But you're basically just summarizing a large work for them. However, sometimes you need to paraphrase an author's key points in your own words because you want to give the same level of detail to support your argument. So if you're talking about someone's key paragraph in a manifesto, you might paraphrase it so that it states the same ideas from that paragraph in your own work. APA for quotations actually discourages it, but when the readers need to see the exact language, that's when you use a quotation. So if you're including law documents or judicial findings, you might want to quote it so there's no ambiguity about what happens with that law or with that judicial finding. Before we go into that, let me go back into my Microsoft Word document. Okay. So here is sort of an example of the dangers of paraphrasing. Let me explain. So at the top, we have an original text. It's municipal wastewater is a continuing threat to the health of aquatic ecosystems in Canada. The first paraphrase is municipal wastewater continues to threaten the health of aquatic ecosystems in Canada. So it's very close to the original text, which means that it's accurate, but it's not original at all. And in fact, could be cited as a type of plagiarism because you're basically only changing a few words in it. So you would probably just end up quoting the original anyway. Next one, we have aquatic ecosystem health in Canada is threatened by municipal wastewater, among other issues. So now the wording is a little bit different. We can say that it's more original in how it's put together. Still appears sort of accurate though, so that's good. The next one, recent research demonstrates that wastewater threatens municipalities in Canada. More original, but maybe losing some of the meaning from the first. And then Canadian marine environments are susceptible to the adverse effects posed by urban effluents. So this one is the most different from the first one. And yet it may not be accurate because when they say aquatic ecosystems, marine typically invokes sort of ocean environments. And that may not be what they're talking about in the first one. And another thing about urban effluence, that may not be a factor in the original text. So paraphrasing is a very careful balancing act of being original with your words, yet at the same time not losing the meaning of the original text. Am I doing on time? Pretty good. Okay. So let me go back into my PowerPoint. So some tips for paraphrasing. Synonyms are always good. Use different parts of speech, change the sentence structure, make ideas concrete if they're too abstract, change from the passive voice to an active voice, and use a variety of citation techniques, which I just showed you with the different APA citations. So different ways that you can think about paraphrasing. Again, writing is recursive. As you're finalizing your project, you may realize that you need more sources in an area. You may realize that you have too many sources and some of them are irrelevant to your current discussion. And so you'll need to take those out. So maybe you finalized your thesis to a degree where it's very specific and some of the sources don't match the thesis at all. And so it's normal for you to take out some studies. That's fine. And you'll be reading and researching all the way up to the final deadline. Again, that is normal. Okay. This is an activity that you can work on with people on your own after this webinar. This is what I did with my students over Zoom, is that I had them eat a snack, then write their reaction to it and describe the taste, texture, smell, and other details to support your opinion. Then you share your writing with your group members and write 2 new paragraphs that synthesize these opinions together to make an argument. So for example, overall the consensus is that the snack is bad. And then you find the majority that claim that the snack is bad. So author 1, author 2. For example, some found that the taste was too salty, and then you give the citations of those that did. Others found that the texture was too rough, and then you give the citations. As someone put it, it tastes like a sock. So that would be a unique quote that is memorable that you would put in to emphasize the snack is bad. However, you also find your counter argument. One person found the snack was actually good. As this person wrote, it tastes like my childhood. Still, as shown by the evidence, overall the snack was perceived as bad. So you find the general connection that the snack is bad, and then you go into each source and you see what are the different factors that make it bad. So you see that connecting your sources is almost like a reverse pyramid in which you start broadly with many sources and then you whittle it down to each unique source. And thank you again for tuning in to this second webinar.